Hello, everyone. I'm Erica Lee. I'm director of the Immigration History Research Center and also a professor of history and Asian American studies. Welcome to our event today. I'm really excited to have you all join us and also for the great conversation that I'm sure is to come. Before we get started, I wanted to first highlight a few housekeeping items. First, this webinar is being recorded. The question and answer portion will happen in the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window. You can submit questions at any time during the presentation. We will turn to audience questions at the end of the program. You can choose to submit questions anonymously if you do not want your name to be mentioned when the question is posted. And also, before we start our program, I wanted to begin with a statement condemning anti-Asian violence on behalf of all of us at the Immigration History Research Center. As I'm sure many of you have been reading about and listening and watching in the news, on March 16th, 2021, 8 people were murdered at 3 different Asian-owned businesses in the greater Atlanta region in a mass shooting. 6 of the 8 victims were Asian women. I had the opportunity to explain to Congress today, this morning, during a House Judiciary Committee's hearings on anti-Asian discrimination and violence. And as I explained to our lawmakers, this massacre is just the latest act of anti-Asian violence in our long history, but especially this year during the pandemic. These are not isolated incidents. They are part of the history of systemic racism and misogyny in the US. For Asian Americans, this history has included laws that barred the entry into the US of all Asians and prevented them from becoming naturalized citizens. This history also includes, of course, the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II, profiling and surveillance of Muslim, Arab, and South Asian Americans after 9/11, and most recently, watching and hearing and listening to some of our highest elected officials deliberately and consistently using racist language tying COVID-19 to Asians. This has included phrases like the Chinese virus, Wuhan virus, Kung flu, and telling Americans to quote unquote blame China for the pandemic. These words have mattered. They still matter, especially when they come from the halls of Congress and when they repeatedly came from the White House during the previous administration. Researchers found that the anti-Asian rhetoric promoted by leaders directly correlated with a rise in racist incidents against Asian Americans. Since the pandemic began, nearly 3,800 anti-Asian incidents of harassment, discrimination, and violence in all 50 states and the District of Columbia have been reported to Stop AAPI Hate, a coalition of Asian American serving organizations. The vast majority, nearly 70%, were directed at Asian women, a pattern that continues a history of both racial and misogynistic anti-Asian violence in the United States. We believe that it's essential for all of us to condemn racism, white supremacy, misogyny, and xenophobia in all of its forms. And at the IHRC, we stand in unity with all individuals and communities who are targets of racial violence and sexual violence. And we support community-centered responses to all of these kinds of violence. I hope that you'll join me to take a few moments of silence as we remember and honor the victims, not only of the shootings in Atlanta, but all of the victims of hate-based and racial violence this past year. Thank you. And now I am so pleased to be able to introduce my colleague, Professor Kim Park Nelson. Kim Park Nelson is an educator and a researcher whose work uses adoption as a lens to understand race and culture. Her work has contributed to building the field of adoption studies and Korean adoption studies in the US and internationally. And we're so fortunate to have her as an affiliate scholar at the IHRC this year. Dr. Park Nelson's book, Invisible Asians, Korean American Adoptees, Asian American Experiences, and Racial Exceptionalism, was published by Rutgers University Press in spring of 2016. You can find out more in the link that's just been posted in our chat. This book was based on her ethnographic research, exploring the many identities of adult Korean adoptees, as well as the cultural, social, historical, and political significance of 60 years of Korean adoption to the United States. Dr. Park Nelson is also the Equity Inclusion Coordinator for the St. Paul-based Interfaculty Organization, or IFO, the labor union for the over 4,000 faculty in the 7-campus Minnesota State University system. She directs and leads equity initiatives within the IFO, consults and advises union and administrative leadership on equity issues, and organizes for empowerment among marginalized faculty within the system. Starting in August of 2021, she will be an associate professor of ethnic studies at Winona State University, where she will teach comparative race and ethnic studies and Asian American studies. We're very proud that she holds a PhD in American Studies from the University of Minnesota, and so happy that she's joining us today and having organized this entire event for us. So thank you so much, Dr. Park Nelson, for joining us.
Thank you so much, Erica, for that introduction. And also thank you so much for your extremely compelling congressional testimony this morning. It was very inspiring to watch you do that. I'm so very honored. So as a Korean adoptee who studies adoption, I am so very honored to have the roundtable panel that we have today. I'm going to allow these folks to introduce themselves, but just very quickly, the three panelists that we have, the roundtable panelists that we have today, are Eleana Kim, who's an associate professor of anthropology at the University of California, Irvine. Kit Myers, who's an assistant professor of ethnic studies at the University of California, Merced, and Greg Luce, who is an attorney with the Adoptee Rights Law Center. So our panel today will be a roundtable panel where I will be asking some questions of the panelists. And then there'll be some time at the end for your questions for the folks who are in attendance today. So my first question is to invite the three of you to give kind of a lengthier introduction of yourselves, but then also to talk about how you became involved in adoption, immigration work or research. Eleana, do you want to start us off?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And first of all, thank you to everyone who helped to organize. Thank you to Erica, Lee. I also wanted to echo Kim's remarks about, echo the gratitude for the work that you've been doing and your testimony today. Thanks to IHRC for hosting this really great event. It's wonderful to be in conversation with the others on this panel. So as for myself, as Dr. Park Nelson mentioned, I'm a professor of anthropology at University of California, Irvine. I should start off by saying that I'm not myself adopted. I'm a Korean American born in Canada, if it's relevant to anyone. But I have been conducting research related to adult Korean adoptees and Korean adoption more generally as a system since 1999. And when I wrote my dissertation, which was also published as a book, the research it started around 1999 and it continued, I guess, up till the present, but really the focus of the book is up till about 2008. It was really looking at this phenomenon of adult Korean adoptees meeting each other for the first time, oftentimes because of the technology made available by the internet. So this network of adult Korean adoptees that now a lot of people recognize as kind of just what the adoptee community is. But it was, the book helps to kind of trace its origins. But another thing that it looked at was the ways in which adoptees were increasingly returning to South Korea, and the ways in which the South Korean government was welcoming adoptees for the first time, and that particular relationship and a lot of the tensions that emerged out of that. But one thing I wanted to mention more specifically in relation to this panel is I find it interesting because as I write in the book and as my research showed at the time, a central question for a lot of adoptees at the moment, and this is again, like in the last 20 years or so, was, are we Korean? Right, having been adopted as infants or young children, raised, let's say in the US or Europe, and being socialized in a certain way, which isn't to say that the belonging in the adoptive country was necessarily not problematic, problem-free, but Koreanness was such a central part of the search for identity and roots. But I think one thing that has definitely arisen more recently, and this is what motivated the article that Kim Park-Nelson and I authored last year, is how now the question of belonging has become even more heightened, and certainly because of the last presidential administration. So a lot of adoptees were beginning to ask questions about, are we immigrants? And that discourse, I think, is really relatively new, and again, conditioned by the anti-immigrant xenophobia that characterized the tenor of the last administration, but as our article suggests, is very deeply rooted, not just in American history, but in the very legislation that governs international adoption and has governed it since the beginning in the 1950s. So I think that's long enough, so I'll end there and let Kim take the spotlight back.
Thanks, Alina. Greg?
Yes.
Do you want
Hi.
to introduce yourself? Yeah.
Sure. My name is Gregory Luce. I'm an attorney and I'm the founder of Adoptee Rights Law Center, which is based in Minneapolis. And I represent Minnesota adopted people, as well as adoptees across the country on issues involving identity, birth records, and U.S. citizenship. I'm also the president of Adoptees United, which is a national nonprofit organization whose mission is to secure equal rights for all adopted people. I'm also an adopted person. I'm born and adopted in the District of Columbia, raised in Oklahoma, and have now settled here in Minnesota for the last 30 years. And my current work grew out of my own experience obtaining factual proof of my own birth. And that's the original birth record, pre-adoption birth record in the District of Columbia, which, as most adoptees know, is sealed. Domestic adoptees know is sealed and unavailable by court order, except by court order. And so it took me many years to have that unsealed and provided to me actually just in the last year. And how complicated that was, as an attorney myself, I felt that I could do something for other domestic adoptees and representing them in court to get their own birth records. From there, and this is 5 years ago, I never in my wildest imagination thought I'd end up in immigration law, which where I am now. And that relates primarily to slowly developing trust between the domestic adoptee community and the inter-country adoptee community, and offering my services generally pro bono or low bono to try to fix a problem that we'll be talking about today, and that is either lack of U.S. citizenship or denial of U.S. citizenship to inter-country adoptees who were adopted by U.S. citizen parents, or the difficulty in proving that citizenship because certain steps weren't taken in the past, and they don't have a naturalization certificate or a certificate of citizenship, have lost it, and often, and especially in this very sort of the security apparatus surrounding identification in the United States makes it very difficult for those clients who have citizenship to prove who they are. Right? And so that's the two components of the immigration law. And never in my mind did I think I'd be involved in immigration law. It's one of the most complex areas of law in the country, but I have this very small niche of representing inter-country adopted people, either proving or securing U.S. citizenship.
Thank you, Greg.
And I want to thank everyone for participating. I'm sort of geeking out talking to these scholars like Kit and Alina and Kim, and it's really great to be on this panel, and I'm thankful to the HRC for hosting this.
Thanks, Greg. We are very delighted to have you as well. Kit?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Yeah, just echoing everybody else and saying thank you very much for having us all here today. And I'm glad you're to be spending this time with you. I guess especially in light of what happened on Wednesday, I think it's important to have these conversations of, you know, how power and inequality operate in the United States. And so thank you for your words at the beginning, Erica. Yeah, my name is Kit Myers. I'm at UC Merced, assistant professor in the History and Critical Race and Ethnic Studies department. I am a transracial adoptee from Hong Kong. I grew up in Oregon. And right now, my research is on race, adoption, and family. In particular, I'm interested in this concept that I call the violence of love and family making. And I was trained in ethnic studies at University of Oregon. So, you know, I came to immigration and adoption through sort of the broad interrogation of nation, ideas of nation and borders. So thinking about Gloria Anzaldúa and Homi Bhabha and Benedict Anderson and their ideas, their conceptualizations of borders and the construction and narration of nation. And then, you know, ideas from Foucault and others about governmentality and how biopolitics plays this role in making people live and letting others die. And I think the most influential scholar that brought me toward the legal aspect of adoption is Cheryl Harris, and her article is called Whiteness is Property. And I think, you know, with property, whether it's real or personal property, there's this idea that it's a bundle of rights, that you have possession, control, exclusion, enjoyment, dispossession, where you can lease, sell, or donate. And so all these rights come with, you know, property rights. And so this conceptualization of property as not just sort of transactional, but that has social and political implications that are tied to racial, gender, and other forms of power, I think really resonated with me. And in some ways, in terms of if we link property to land and how the nation in some ways is a large piece of stolen property, where you have the possession, control, exclusion, enjoyment, etc. So all these sort of characteristics are attached to the nation. And so how's the nation constructed, and how are the borders constructed, who's let in, who's let out, or who's let in and who's excluded, really sort of resonated with my own experience, and I think others when it comes to transnational adoption. So that's kind of how I got to my interest in immigration and adoption.
Thank you, Kit. So the first question that I have for the three of you is very broad and is kind of connected to the title and the topic of this webinar. The first question is, in your view, how did adoption become, and I'm kind of putting up some square quotes here, an immigration problem? I know that each of you have sort of different perspectives based on your practice and on your research. And so, Alina, do you want to start? You can just keep the same order.
Sure. Thank you. And I'll just preface my remarks by saying that, since Kim and I co-authored this piece, much of what I'm saying is kind of like part of our dual-headed Hydra mind. So, but I think that, as I was saying earlier, both Kim and I noticed, and we weren't alone in this, obviously, that there was an increasingly urgent discourse and set of questions being asked among adult adoptees under the previous administration, but also in light of some very high-profile deportation cases involving adoptees from Korea and other countries. And with that, with those cases came a lot of fear and a lot of insecurity, and a kind of, so even adoptees who might have full citizenship, who are, have all the necessary paperwork, there was still a very strong psychic effect of these deportation cases and the circulation of the stories in news media and social media. And so I think one of the things that motivated our research was to sort of understand how these legal cases can have these ramifying effects. And one ramifying effect is activism, which we also discuss, and Adoptees for Justice is a group that many people may be aware of, dealing with this problem on Capitol Hill, trying to advocate for legislation to be passed that would cover all adoptees, regardless of criminal background or other kinds of questions, because the range of adoptees who could be affected, and Greg can speak to this more specifically, is broader than one might think. So to get more specific about how adoption can become an immigration problem, I think that for a lot of people, just putting those two terms together, adoption and immigration, is confusing, because international adoption has always been thought of as the inclusion of a child from another country into a family, and that one act would sort of negate any other questions about belonging, because the family has always been constituted as such a central part of American society. And in the article that Kim and I authored, when you look at the legislative history of adoption in this country, international adoption to this country dating from the 1950s, you see very clearly the ways in which the law is an immigration law, number one. And number two, produced the very problem of adoption as immigration from its outset, because it generated a gap between family and nation, meaning children who are adopted come through as immigrants, but then the adoption is finalized in family court, which is governed by states. So in that gap produced this issue where adoptees might be adopted, but never got naturalized, or maybe were naturalized, but were never finalized in terms of their adoption. And that gap, we argue, is very much conditioned by the anti-immigrant sentiment that has been a hallmark of American history. So when we look at the legislative past, there are a lot of, no surprise, a lot of Republican congresspeople who opposed the inclusion of all adoptees under the Child Citizenship Act of 2000, which would have included, which would have gotten rid of the problem of adoptees who were never naturalized. But the kinds of, we talk about the Trump administration as this climate of anti-immigration, but anti-immigration has been kind of climate that has been around for a very long time. So and we see that in the laws, and we also see it in the ways that the laws have been written to privilege white adoptive parents, or adoptive parents who are primarily white, over the child who is supposed to be included without question as a member of American society. So that's my very long-winded answer to your question.
Thanks, Alina. Yeah, it was such an interesting process to kind of the evolution of the writing of that article, because, Alina and I first started talking about that article during this period where there started to be some like more visible activism, especially in the Korean adoptee community, about folks who were kind of in the public eye around that were kind of scheduled for deportation. But I think that the conversation like really got heated up like once the Trump administration started, and we started to see all of these adoptees kind of thinking through these issues of citizenship and immigration identification in a way that we hadn't before it. I think that that's certainly true, that there's this gap between sort of federal immigration law and the state systems that kind of control adoption law. But I think that there's also this kind of cultural gap that exists, right, between adoptees sort of culturally naturalized in ways to think of themselves as Americans, in a way that isn't always sort of like underwritten by like very spotty patchwork legal system that would include them as American citizens. Greg, I'm imagining you have very much to add to this conversation.
I do. What I really liked about Kim and Alina's article was grappling with this idea of adoptee as immigrant. It's something that actually in working within the adoptee rights community, it's something that kind of splits the community. Some people say, no, this is a foreign policy issue, and others say, no, this is an immigration issue. And your article really takes that on, and I think really explains, the thinking around that. And I think the term sometimes you use is I may have it backwards here, but non-immigrant immigrant, or yeah. And so I think that really captures it, because a lot of my clients, it's the first time I break to them that, no, you're an immigrant. And these are clients who have been in the country, some of them for 50 years, and they're still not citizens. And then I have to explain to them, you're treated as an immigrant and you immigrated to this country. The adoption was, as you say, this family law component of that, but that's how you're classified and that's how you're treated. And it's eye-opening, not for many, but for some, that they are in fact classified as an immigrant. The sort of getting to the question of when did this become a problem, the other thing I really appreciate about the article, it gives you a really great historical context to where we are today. And that's really what I'm dealing with, is where we are today. And I usually, on this issue, I usually get two questions. I get the question, how did this happen? And then I get the question, what do I do now? And these questions are asked by different groups of people. This first question of how did this happen comes from adoptive parents, comes from people you tell at a dinner party about the issue, people who don't live that experience, and they're just amazed that intercountry adoptees who are adopted by U.S. citizen parents aren't automatically given U.S. citizenship. And how I try to explain that, and I go back really to 2000, but your article goes back further, which is terrific. That it was made possible by, I call neglect, and that whether that neglect was benign or whether it was calculated. And it may have been benign through adoptive parents who had no idea that decades ago their child had to naturalize, or that an adoption needed to be finalized in the US if it wasn't finalized in the country of origin. And that's still the case today. Or it could have been more calculated to save money, because finalizing an adoption in the US was expensive. Or the whole process of adoption in itself was very expensive and still is. And it could have been an adoption agency that dropped the ball in working with adoptive parents to assure that the children that were brokered for adoption were provided U.S. citizenship. But in 2000, it was politically calculated. And that's what happened when U.S. Congress cut out this loophole, so that if you're an adoptee that was born essentially prior to 1983, if you're 18 and over in February of 2001, you weren't eligible for automatic citizenship, and you still aren't today. And the presumption has always been, especially among domestic adoptees, is that if you're legally adopted by a U.S. citizen parent, then you are a U.S. citizen. I mean, that applies as well to the presumption of intercountry adoptees. Because adoption's main focus is to create the fiction that you are as if born to the adoptive parents. And that fiction falls apart in the United States when it comes to adoption and intercountry adoptees, particularly U.S. citizenship. It matters not to whom you were born, but where you were born. And the fiction of adoption has not extended legally to people born in a country outside of the U.S. And that's the crux of, from the legal standpoint, what we're faced with when we have tens of thousands of intercountry adoptees that currently lack U.S. citizenship. So, and I'll get to the the second question I always get, and that second question is, what do I do now? And that usually comes from adoptees that I work with and trying to figure out a path of to get citizenship or prove citizenship.
Thank you, Greg. And also thank you for saying that our article provided great historical context in front of Erica Lee, because she was my PhD advisor. And so I really appreciate that.
I reread it today too. Yeah.
Kit, you know, I think that the way that we've been framing this so far, this question about how adoption became an immigration problem, kind of focuses on this idea that there's a gap, or that there's some inconsistencies or kind of incontinuity. But I think that your perspective, which I really want to hear more about, is kind of thinking through the idea of these gaps or these inconsistencies or these sort of like misconnections as actually uniquely American. And so, yeah, I'm very interested to hear your perspective on this question as well.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate what everybody's sort of bringing to this conversation. I do think, you know, what's interesting is with transnational adoption is that it was, you know, considered a solution in many ways to a lot of things. I mean, of course, the idea of children in need and families who wanted children, but also that it would, you know, help solve racism in the United States. And it was a continuation of the narrative that the nation is a nation of immigrants. And so to sort of bring immigrants of color into white American families sort of perpetuate that narrative. And so then answer to the question of how your article actually answers, which is that it became an immigration problem the moment transnational adoption started, because you know, as your essay reflects and shows, that in the 1950s, those adoptions were dependent on the Refugee Relief Act, and when that couldn't provide, you know, the legal framework to adopt more than 2 children, individual private bills were passed in order to facilitate adoption. And then in 1961, the Immigration and National, the INA, Immigration and Nationality Act, was revised so that it created the orphan visa. And then 1978, it was amended to, you know, abolish the 2 visa limit for adoptive families, and to try and shorten that naturalization waiting period that was required. And I think what your article explains really well is that that those 2 things that were sort of abolished in 1978 were there to sort of protect children and protect the sort of potential for unethical adoptions to happen. And so if you had a 2-year wait period for naturalization, then if the adoption were found to be like the child were stolen or without consent, then the child could be returned and still have citizenship in their home country. And so it is very interesting, your sort of historical tracing and legal tracing of how adoption has unfolded, transnational adoption has unfolded, really shows that it's been sort of this immigration conundrum that has to keep being addressed in very specific ways. And then the biggest, thing was in 1996 with the two major pieces of legislation, the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act and the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, which are these really long, gigantic bills, bipartisan, I might add, sort of this neoliberal push to criminalize immigrant bodies. And so they essentially made it easier to deport criminals. And so then adult adoptees found themselves in this really precarious legal position. So I think when we think about it in the sort of most dire sense, it was the 1996 that creates this situation. But I think we can really take it back to the beginning of when it started. But we also have, I think, other examples to look to. The falsification of records that the article also points out to, but also we can think about the ban on adoption. Their investigation committee found fraud, coercion, and child laundering, which is not, we knew this before from David Smollen's work, from Catherine Joyce's work, from a lot of people who have been studying adoption, that a lot of adoptions are either, illicit, if not illegal. And so this creates immigration problems. Here in the US, we oftentimes ignore and sort of look the other way, but it doesn't mean that the problems don't exist, right? And then I do want to mention, that it creates immigration problems the other direction too. I think for, adoptees who want to repatriate or, go back to their birth country, I think there are problems there with either having to, serve in the military if you're a Korean adoptee, or in Hong Kong, trying to get a Hong Kong ID card is very difficult. I mean, you're supposedly able to do it, but it's very difficult, and even more so now. I wrote my own sort of article on this sort of deportation cases, and I think what I want to highlight from that chapter is that, as Kim Park Nelson said, that family separation is deeply American, and so the deportation provisions in 1996, are nothing really that new, but it did create a sort of, it highlights very starkly how a rescuable sort of rights-bearing orphan is constructed in relation to a deportable adult adoptee. And so, this situation, this sort of neoliberal context that dismantles the welfare state and prioritizes goods over bodies is really what helps shift the orphan. So when the orphan becomes an adult, they're no longer this good, right? They're no longer this neoliberal good that is rescuable, but they're this sort of responsible adult that did something criminal. And so I think, you know, the idea that you know, that this is something new or exceptional or an aberration to sort of American sort of ethos, or I think is wrong, because it's really been the separation of families, especially families of color, has happened, you know, since slavery and Native American boarding schools and you know, even domestic transracial adoption.
Kit, thank you. I just want to remind all of the participants who are here viewing, we would love to answer your questions, and so please don't be shy. Go ahead and put your questions into the Q&A that's at the bottom of your screen, and hopefully there will be many, and we will have the opportunity to answer your questions. So Kit, you touched on actually the kind of the topic of my next question, which is kind of all about the criminalization, like who's criminalized in adoption processes. And I think that this is one of these areas where the cognitive dissonance that some adoptees might have, that they don't identify as immigrants, really comes into sharp focus. And specifically because of the deportation policies for people who are sentenced in the American criminal justice system. So my next question is, who's criminalized in adoption processes, and how is that culture determined? And many of you have already talked about anti-immigration policies and the contribution, how that's contributed to this process. I think, Greg, I'm going to start with you for this question, because I feel like my guess is that you have sort of many examples of how this operates within the legal system currently.
Yeah, and so I guess I should start when I get a new client. I'm sorry about the sun. I tried to block it out and then it fell on me. So when I get a new client, one who lacks U.S. citizenship, the two biggest questions I always ask is, have you ever voted? And do you have a criminal record? And there are exemptions if you've voted and you reasonably believed you were a U.S. citizen because your parents were either your parents were U.S. citizens, whether adopted or not. But there's very few exceptions for many of the criminal records or criminal convictions that bar you from naturalizing. And that list is long, and that list is very complicated. And comparing a state conviction to what the federal code requires, whether it's an aggravated felony, whether it's a certain crime that would bar you from naturalizing, is extremely complicated. And it almost seems, and they probably did, this just sort of these favorite crimes that you want to just throw onto the immigration system that congressional leaders do not want to see someone convicted of those crimes becoming citizens. And that's become a bar to, and that's really what happened in 2000 when they passed the Child Citizenship Act and excluded, as Kit talks about, criminals. They redefined adoptee as a criminal, and as part of the what we now call the crimmigration system, where it's combining criminal record with immigration. And so it doesn't matter that they were adopted by U.S. citizen parents as a child; they've been recommodified into potential criminals, and we're not going to give citizenship to those potential criminals. So the criminal conviction is one of the biggest barriers. Obviously, it leads to deportation. It is a chilling effect on intercountry adoptees who want to participate more fully in their communities. Some are in hiding. Some don't want to, and I would not advise them to seek naturalization, because you don't want to catch the attention of of ICE, and suddenly you're in deportation proceedings. So it is a controlling component of the immigration system, and it's being used as well on adoptees.
Kit or Alina, do you also want to respond to this question?
I would just say, I mean, it's a little bit, I don't want to be redundant, but I feel like much of what Kit said earlier is so relevant to this question in terms of, I loved how you phrased it, Kit, you know, in terms of like the sort of conversion of the adopted child as a commodity, oftentimes framed as a gift, but really like a good of some kind. You know, the value is considered priceless, but also there's obviously a price tag. And the facilitation of that versus the adult adopted person who is often racialized as an other, and the revaluation of that person in this crimmigration
It's hard to
system,
say.
crimmigration, or like the deportation regime as others call it. So I think that that's a key part of this. And the psychic effects, I think, have to do, you know, the chilling effect that Greg just mentioned, I think has precisely to do with this fact where, you know, you have people who embody both, right? How do you hold both of those values in your mind, you know, knowing that you embody this one, you know, you are an individual of a kind. So, but I think that's where like the biopolitics that Kit was talking about earlier really comes into play. Like the technology works precisely in that way to, you know, frighten people into submission, to put it, you know, kind of simply. And I think one of the ways I saw this playing out early on, like around like the case of Russell Green, who I know was a kind of early case of a person undergoing deportation hearings, and adoptees, principally in Minnesota, I think kind of really organized to help publicize his case. But there, and I'm thinking of that particular PSA that was produced in the Twin Cities, where adoptees, you know, and their families kind of came forward to say, like, we could be Russell Green, you know, this idea that there's a collective identification with that biopolitical position, you know, in which, you know, given the way that the system operates and given the way that people are beginning to understand how the system operates, you know, any person could be caught in that net, you know, and maybe it's just good fortune that some are more secure than others. But I think that collective identification is really key to breaking through the kinds of ideological discourses around criminality, you know, because so much of the the effect of the crimmigration system is to instill fear and silence among people who don't want to be caught up in it, right? So, but it also reminds me of something that came up when Kim and I were authoring this article, which was, you know, I think the copy editor pointed it out too. It's like we would say, you know, adoptees and other immigrants, because we were saying adoptees are immigrants, but then to say and other immigrants, you know, might presume too much, because we don't know, we know that not all adoptees identify as immigrants. So there the status question also comes up, you know, where I do think it's important for that, you know, legally, as Greg was mentioning earlier, for adoptees to recognize that they are seen in that status, you know, from a federal immigration legal point of view, and to just in terms of enhance adoptees' agency. I think like encouraging people to grapple with that question. It doesn't have to be because they're in solidarity with other immigrants, that is happening, but to just grapple with the very fact of that, you know, that the nation state sees them in a certain way that could potentially put them in a situation of heightened vulnerability along with other immigrants. And, but certainly among a lot of activists, you now see an identification, not just with other immigrants, but as an immigrant or as immigrants. And I think that's a really interesting shift.
Just one quick thought, and I mean, I always deal with these on a very sort of real practical level, and we talk about this chilling effect, which is very, very palpable. Part of what you do when you represent clients in the immigration system is you have to figure out, what does the government already know about you? And so you request all the records that USCIS currently has, but you also have to worry about if they have a criminal record, no matter how far back it goes. I mean, I'm dealing with clients that have criminal records from 40 years ago, and USCIS really wants to know what happened then. But the only way to really know what the government knows is you need to physically get a fingerprint card and ask your client to put their fingerprints on this fingerprint card and send it to the FBI, so you get back a rap sheet that then tells you, when you apply for naturalization, this is what the USCIS is going to learn about you. And I've lost clients because that was a necessary component, because we're not going to go blind into this process. And clients will not even go forward with, and I don't blame them. Here I am telling you you're an immigrant. Now I am telling you you could be a criminal immigrant, and then constantly sort of redefining who you are. They had enough of that, and they said, no thanks. I'm just going to stay where I am, and I'm not going to rock the boat, and hopefully things will work out. And so that very practical, those steps you have to take, long steps, it takes a year or more just to get through some of these steps, is an exhausting, often humiliating, very tough process for many intercountry adoptees. And I think that I need to acknowledge that.
Kit, do you want to make a quick response here before we go to audience questions?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing I want to add, which is it shows up in both of our papers, but just to highlight, is that the portable transnational adoptee is a legal construction. I mean, it could have been legally sort of solved, but it is constructed purposefully because legislators did not want to make an exception for people who committed crimes, adoptees who committed crimes, to be granted automatic citizenship. And so there was a hard line stance against that. And so the original bill was revised so that adult adoptees would not be considered for citizenship. And that sort of hard stance against criminal and adult adoptees is in many ways the idea of, Shandon Reddy has, his book is called Freedom with Violence, and it's the idea of the liberal sort of freedoms that we give people in the United States or otherwhere. It comes with violence, and part of that is, we wouldn't be able to understand what freedom was if we didn't prevent freedom for other people, right? There has to be sort of unfreedom for us to sort of value our freedom. And I think that is the sort of the neoliberal and conservative understanding of freedom, and why adoptees are sort of, that this legal sort of construct exists in the first place. And then the other thing I just want to add is not only just like, who is criminalized in the adoption process, and we've been focusing on adoptees, but, kind of going back to what I said before, who is not criminalized, right? Whether it's adoption agencies who are neglectful, or adopted parents who are neglectful, or the US government who sort of facilitates illicit adoptions, I think is the other part of, these larger questions for many things of who's considered criminal, who's considered corrupt, and who can ultimately be punished for that, or not punished.
Thank you, Kit. So even though our event officially ends at 4, I'm hoping that our panelists have agreed to stay a little bit longer. And so I'm hoping that there are many of you who can also stay a little bit longer. as we field some of these questions that you have asked in the Q&A. Of course, if you need to step out at 4, we are totally understanding. I am selfishly going to ask a question that, well, I'm going to read a question from the audience that is something that really bothers me that I would really like to address here today. The question is, there are vast discrepancies between the numbers cited for adoptees who became citizens through the Child Citizenship Act of 2000. Some say 75,000, others say 150,000. Do you know why that discrepancy exists? I'm really glad that that somebody asked this question, because there is all kinds of uncertainty about numbers in terms of the naturalized population, in terms of the number of people, the number of adoptees who have entered the United States on orphan visas, which is kind of like the vehicle that was created to bring adoptees into the country for the purpose of adoption. I am completely not surprised that there's this huge discrepancy. And I mean, I think one of the things that that's been a burning question for me is how many undocumented adoptees are there actually currently in the United States? And we have no idea how many there are. And I think that part of that, you know, one of the things that Alina and I really tried to take apart is part of that, you know, for a big part of the history of federal immigration policy on adoption, I don't think anybody dreamed that an adoptee would ever be deported. You know, this is something that started to happen after the acts that Kit referenced in the late 90s, or I guess in the mid 90s. And so, you know, as a nation, we actually have done like not a very good job of counting how many people it is that we're talking about. Greg, I don't know if you have any additional thoughts on this question about numbers, or if Alina, you do.
I'll just say that the numbers for both inter-country adoptees and domestic adoptees have always fallen very short. They just stopped tracking them, and we don't even know how many. I mean, an organization called the Adoptee Rights Campaign spent considerable effort trying to figure out how many inter-country adoptees do not presently have citizenship, and, you know, did kind of a statistical analysis, and they came up with the figure between 35,000 and 50,000. The State Department, I think, doesn't agree with that figure, but no one's been tracking those numbers, and so you're right. It's frustrating not to have good statistics so we know how big or small the problem is.
Yeah, and I think here a comparison with other countries is pretty apt. Like if we consider a lot of the European receiving nations, where international or inter-country adoption is always centralized and regulated more, I mean, not like it was a perfect system, but more regulated than the US, where adoption has always been privatized, and a strong adoption lobby has fought to keep it that way. Yeah, you see just, you know, the numbers are not well tracked at all. And there's not a clear sense of how adoptees came into the country. You know, Kit earlier mentioned the well-documented cases of fraud related to adoptions from many nations. And, you know, I met an adoptee who during the Trump years was truly frightened, because she was an adoptee who knew that she had been trafficked, essentially, and that she entered into the US under another child's name and identity. And she had a legitimate fear that she could be denaturalized based on that. So this goes back to the question of accountability and you know, which parties may be held responsible. But the very fact that she thought that in her case, if it were ever to come to light, that she would be the person framed as guilty, right? Not a system or not other adults who had facilitated the adoption. So I feel like that's just a kind of symptom of the ways in which the the legal technologies and the specific ideologies that we've been talking about around anti-immigration and adoption as family making and not as immigration come to light.
Kim, there's a question I'm seeing, if you don't mind me just tackling it real quick, on it's a Korean adoptee who states that needed to had a name change and needed to get that name change recorded on a certificate of citizenship, or it could have been a certificate of naturalization. More recently, the USCIS has now required what's called biometrics in order to get a duplicate of your certificate of citizenship. And what that means is that you go into the biometrics office and your fingerprints are taken and your photograph is taken, and they're trying to consider other biometrics that they want to collect on these people. And these people are they're citizens, but they're treated very differently, and especially even if they're adopted by U.S. citizen parents. So that is a real issue, and I'm watching this, how this biometrics is being expanded by USCIS and Homeland Security to capture citizens, whether through adoption or naturalization or whatever, and it's a serious issue.
Thanks, Greg. I think I'm gonna pick another question here, unless Alina or Kit, you have something that you would like to address.
Well, maybe since the question about the number discrepancy referred to the paper that I wrote, my guess is that that because it conferred citizenship on anyone who was under 18, that they just calculated how many adoptions happened, via the State Department sort of tracking who were under 18. And so that was the number, but the 75,000, I mean, could be like how many actually sort of, because you get citizenship, but you still have to like kind of go through and get the certificate and stuff. So who knows? I mean, what the 150,000 represents, like, because we're under 18 years old, that's what the 150 sort of refers to. 150,000 refers to.
Kit, thanks for clarifying that. So here's a question. Okay, so here's a question. Most of the news I see around adoptee citizenship, or the lack thereof, is about people adopted to American families. Do you know if there are similar issues in other countries with inter-country adoptees discovering that they do not have citizenship or the means to prove their citizenship?
I'm just trying to understand the U.S. immigration laws. There are citizenship issues in other countries. It's so complicated. I don't want to wade in on it. I know there's been problems in the Netherlands related to how adopted child entered the country. But I think the U.S. certainly has the biggest problem currently.
I don't know all the laws in the other countries, but I do know that among the like what in the conversation that adult Korean adoptees have across different national contexts, many of those from European countries are just flabbergasted that international adoptees would have this issue. It's just unthinkable. And, a lot of Americans do too, but, yeah, it's, but I think, as I was saying earlier, I think my sense is that even if there are problematic cases in other nations, the centralization of the adoption system in those countries kind of mitigates against the issues that face adoptees who come into the US. So a comparative analysis actually is probably, would be quite interesting.
It would be, yeah, I would like to see that.
Yeah, Alina, that's kind of what I have heard as well. Like I've heard very isolated cases of, I think that I heard of one case that I wasn't really able to kind of get much information on, of somebody who was deported from, I want to say the UK long ago. But I think that the citizenship issue is mostly a US problem. And I think that, you know, one of the reasons that is there's this kind of split between, as we've been talking about, the split between immigration policy, which is federal, and adoption policy, which is state. Of course, like other nations don't have that kind of dual system. And so, you know, that most other nations, there's some central authority that sort of kind of oversees inter-country adoption that's nationally based and that kind of feels all of it. And so, I mean, I think that that's kind of like the practical reason behind why that is. But yeah, like for me, like, yes, I've heard of a couple of sort of isolated cases outside the United States, but I think that this is actually an American problem.
There's, Elena, did you have something else?
Oh, I was just going to add that, you know, and when it comes to accountability, I think it makes it more interesting in other, I'm thinking particularly of Denmark, where the central authority there was, you know, criticized and actually had to reform itself because of some fraudulent and highly unethical adoptions that came to light in the recent past. So, you know, another difference there in terms of how the different systems operate.
And then, Kim, I was going to say, I saw another quick question I could take if you want, and that's about cases of countries refusing to accept adoptees that have been deported by the U.S. And yes, there are countries that refuse deportees. Vietnam is an example in the question, and it is one of the countries that will not accept deportees. I know a leader of adoptee advocate group that is a Vietnamese adoptee and under deportation order, but Vietnam will not take him. The other one I would say, I describe a case on my website of Christian Worthman, who was adopted from Mexico. And if you want to see a flabbergasted judiciary when they're faced with these cases, this is the best example of it. And there's a video in that, and I'll put a link to the article. There's a video of the court case in my post. But Mexico wouldn't take him because they considered him a U.S. citizen, and the U.S. was trying to deport him because they claimed he was a Mexican citizen. So he was in many respects stateless. And I think the court in that case kind of just punted and hoped that it would get resolved over the next few months because they were just waiting on approval of a certain visa that may resolve it. But the judges in that case were human and said, "Are you kidding me? You're trying to deport this person to Mexico, and Mexico doesn't want him. And what are you going to do? Deport him to another country?" And the attorney for the U.S. said, "Well, we're looking at other countries." So that's how crazy it's become.
And also, I think, I mean, it also points to the discretionary power of a lot of the bureaucrats and judges involved in these cases. So I'm thinking in particular of one adoptee, an incarcerated adoptee who was undocumented, never naturalized, who described ICE officers coming into the prisons and basically like seeking out people who might be undocumented so they could be put into detention. But when they got to him, they passed him over because they're like, "Oh, you're adopted, you don't count." You know, so, you know, that was his, you know, quote unquote, good fortune that day. But of course, once he was released, he was still in the same position of having to figure out how to normalize his situation if possible. So.
Yeah, I've seen other cases of this sort of wink, wink, "Oh, you don't count." And yeah, it's crazy to see.
Yeah.
Well, I think that both of these cases that you talked about, Greg, also kind of underline this issue of how people get lost in the system, right? I mean, I know the person that you're talking about who is under deportation orders but has not been deported because Vietnam basically has no record of him ever being born in Vietnam. And so I really thought about that case because it's like, well, on the one hand, like he's sort of being saved from being deported because of this. But on the other hand, talk about a total erasure, right? I mean, these are people who have kind of been through this like rather complicated legal process, and their whole existence has been lost into it. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I think that this is one of the reasons that, the situation of family separation at the border has been so triggering for so many adoptees in the United States, because we know that the act of deciding not to keep track of who belongs with who and who's related to who is probably responsible for many international adoptees being in the United States in the first place. And it's completely avoidable, but it's just something that it's that kind of carelessness with someone's life that kind of results in a lot of this, which is of course a terrible thing. I think that we are just about out of time. So I do want to thank all three of you for participating in our roundtable today. I think that we were able to have a really interesting discussion. I also want to thank the staff of the IHRC and Erica Lee for hosting us today. And all of you who participated in the who came to see us today and ask questions. Thank you so much for attending our event today. We really appreciate your interest. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.